Kuzambola Mchunizuk Selden, the Journalists Association of Bhutan has published a legal guidebook for Bhutanese journalists. This is the first such document in the country. To talk about it, we have Namgizam, Executive Director of JAB, Kinzong Jukpa, Legal Consultant, Bhutanese Legal Solutions, and Kinga Tenzin Doji, a freelance journalist. So welcome. And my first question is, what is this book about? We'll start with Namgim.
So this legal guidebook for Bhutanese journalists, there was a huge gap in legal knowledge among journalists. I think some of us assume that we know the legal proceedings in the country and then we're familiar with some legal terminology. But as we were doing the research for the book, along with people from Ox Media who are journalists as well, who are helping JAB, and then legal consultants from Bhutanese Legal Solutions, we discovered that there's a lot of things even somebody like me isn't aware of. Not just legal terminology, but the legal process itself. So then with this book, we are hoping that, I mean, it's really simplified, that our journalists will find some kind of information to help them when they're dealing with anything that is related to the profession, because it's not just about understanding legal terminology, but it's also about protecting yourself as a journalist and what are your rights, but also more importantly, what are your limitations.
I mean, along the same lines, could you tell me a little about why JAB initiated this book? Why did JAB launch such a book?
I think it also stems from my own experience, having had to undergo a defamation suit. Through that experience, I realized that there's so much that so many journalists, including myself, don't understand about legal proceedings in Bhutan. And if given an opportunity, I was thinking as the Executive Director of the Journalists Association of Bhutan, I want to be in a position to be able to help other journalists understand these legal matters and then see if there's a way that they could empower themselves with this knowledge. And luckily and fortunately, we had applied for this project with UNESCO, and via the Global Media Defense Fund, we applied for a project called For a Free and Fair Media, and they funded this. So because of their funding, this became possible. So it's been something I wanted to do for a really long time as a journalist, and it's been made possible thanks to my work at the Journalists Association of Bhutan.
I'm going to ask my next question to the legal consultant here, Kinzang. What legal provisions protect journalists?
Okay, so in short, I'd say we don't really have any laws that protect journalists. So this legal handbook is more about the steps journalists can take to protect themselves from being accused of infringing laws like defamation. However, there is Article 7, there's supposed to be freedom of press, right? But Parliament till now has not created any law stating what exactly this freedom is, or how this freedom of press is limited, what the limitations are. So there isn't any legal clarity on what that means as of now. So if such a law is enacted in the future, there might be some protection for journalists, but as of now, this legal handbook is more about the steps a journalist can take to protect themselves from being in breach of the law or from being accused of it.
I see. I also want to ask, why has this taken so long then? For us to come up with something like this?
Oh, because first of all, you need funds to do something like this, which is like the truth, I think, the sad truth. And also because you need somebody, I think, in the Journalists Association of Bhutan to realize, okay, maybe we need to do something like this. Like I was telling you, the assumption is, and also it stems from a place of confidence. Most journalists feel that we know how to do these things. And if we need to ask questions, we can always reach out to somebody in the legal fraternity. But that isn't the case. When this came out, I think Osup has like some really interesting things to share. I think his views on this book. I think he might want to jump in and then see what do you think. Because we wanted this for a long time, but it's just because there needs to be people who can come in, who can understand the laws, and then we needed somebody who came from a legal background and somebody from a journalism background. And then at this time, while I'm at JAB, I think this was the perfect opportunity for us to work on something like this, and we got the funding. So it was like the right time, right place. I agree with you that, I mean, it's been so long. We should have had this from the start of journalism in Bhutan, but we didn't. And I think it's only recently due to certain circumstances that journalists find ourselves in that we felt, or maybe now is an opportune time for us to bring out something like this also.
And please.
I would say Namgi hit the nail right on the head. I think for many of us who've been in the profession for a long time, much of what we did over the years was a process of trial and error and learning from experts in a particular field. So if there were legal matters that we had to wrestle with or grapple with, then we would go to somebody who was in the legal profession and seek a consultation that way. So similarly, if you were to write a finance story, then you might have a friend in the bank who you might want to consult, So that was our process. So I suppose we must have just gotten used to that. And thanks to people in JAB like Namgye who realized that this is something that's important. Because when my very first impression when I came across this book, as I browsed through it, was that how I wish we had had a book like this, a handbook like this when we started off. It would have made things so much easier, because one of the most difficult things that I had to grapple with when I started off my career was that I was never sure whether I was on the right about doing anything. It could be as simple as just walking up to a minister at a meeting and saying, I want a copy of a speech. Is that permissible? Even a small thing like that, I had to hesitate about it. I had to think twice about it. So all those things are now things that you can just brush by the wayside, thanks to the knowledge that you get from this document, this fantastic document, by the way.
Let's see. Just to put this out there, Soup is here representing the journalists, more as a beneficiary of the guidebook. Namgye, now that the book is out, what is your expectations?
My expectation is that we can. I remember when we were drafting the proposal to submit to UNESCO, that this was something we wanted to look at as moral boosting for our journalists. Like Soup was also saying how you'd hesitate. Oh, can I do this? Am I allowed to do that? Am I not allowed to do this? So we're hoping that this book, with the kind of information that is available in it, that it bolsters the confidence as well as the morale of journalists, so they know, oh, I can actually do this. So I can push the envelope this far. It is allowed by law, and I'm not really breaking any rules, etc. So that you're not in an ambiguous place anymore. I mean, of course, I hate looking at things in black and white, but when it comes to the law, I guess it's black and white, right, Okunsa? So yeah, I'm hoping that this will have not just journalists, but I think anybody who wants some kind of legal information on how you can go about doing things in Bhutan, especially if you're afraid of defamation, etc., then this guidebook is great for you as well.
Let's see. What legal areas could journalists get in trouble with?
Okay, I think defamation is obviously the big one, and that's the one that journalists have had issues with. So there's defamation, and also maybe some issues with invasion of privacies, in the sense that, some journalists were saying they record conversations just to keep a record of what is being said to them, and now that may be an invasion of privacy, and the courts may not allow that. I think a judge in our conference said that he generally doesn't allow recorded conversations when it's recorded without the other person's consent. So things like that. But the main issue is defamation, and so I think in the Bhutan Penal Code, it's supposed to be intentionally communicating false or distorted information that damages the person's reputation. So, basically it's just journalists have to take common sense steps, I think, that would protect them a lot. So things like corroborating the facts, not just getting news from one source, talking to both sides, and not cherry picking facts, being careful about not putting headlines that are damaging and then burying the facts in the story, things like that. I mean, those are just basic ethical things, I think, that if you're an ethical journalist, you probably won't get in trouble with defamation.
I see.
There are also a lot of gray areas. I mean, like trespassing, for example. That's another area that's become quite clear, more clear now, especially if you're in a place that is clearly open for public access. But then, let's say you are at a hospital premises, for example, but you're taking photographs within the premises. So certain things become a little more clearer there, whether it's permissible to take a photograph there or not, or from outside of the premises or whatever. So many of these things were trashed out, and there were many incidentals as well, things that came about as a result of this happy union of legal professionals and journalists. Yeah, it was a happy union.
Okay, you have already gone through the guidebook.
Right.
Were there anything in the guidebook that caught you off guard that you did not know before?
Yeah. I mean, things like we find that most, even as far as the courts are concerned, legal proceedings in a court, we were very unclear about whether, the media access to certain court proceedings are permissible or not. We know that it ought to be, that it makes court proceedings more transparent and fair. But we also found that the court can, on occasion, prohibit the media from attending certain proceedings, depending on many factors. Now, it's interesting because there could be things like it may be an invasion of this or that party's privacy as well. But what we also find now is that if the court were to decide in such a situation, then it would fall upon the court also to be very clear about it, to explain themselves how a person's privacy might be violated, and that is why the media is not. By that same token, in the absence of a clear definition of the right to information as well, which I wanted a deeper discussion on this, but we couldn't do it over the 2 days. But I'm sure this will come up. Also, was that while the right to information is enshrined in the Constitution, there is no definite act on it. So it's still a very vague and very broad term. But going by the principles that are enshrined in the Constitution, we ought to be able to get access to information in the government as well. And if the government decides, let's say, what is this, Bhutan Penal Code, Section 17, for example, says the ministry may, on the orders of the cabinet, direct a licensee to stop transmission of certain news or information in the public interest. So we find that public interest is a very broad term here, and it's pretty vague as well. But in such a situation, if the ministry was to tell a media outlet, hey, you can't broadcast this, then it would fall upon the ministry or the cabinet to clarify that and to make it very clear. In the absence of which, if they don't do it, then the journalist could take the cabinet or the ministry to court, to a court of law. And that's something we didn't know.
Yeah, and thanks to, I mean, we had Kunsang also present on this. We had this 2-day workshop right after the launch of the book, where we had a little bit of, it was a familiarization conference between people from the legal legal background as well as journalists. So we had all of these discussions right around this book. I mean, it was really important, and pointed out to us too. I mean, I don't know if you want to jump in now and then share how you.
I think we have a lot of budding constitutional lawyers now among the journalists. I'm so glad you're paying close attention. But yeah, the thing is, the overarching, I think, message we got was that there are certain constitutional rights, and none of those, the limits of those rights have not been tested in court yet, because we haven't had a case, right? And usually what happens is, when you have a constitution, at least in the US, you have a constitutional right, or in India, the party will take it to court, and then the court will further clarify, because the Constitution can't go into depth of exactly what everything means, and then the highest court of the country will say, well, this is what it means. And in the absence of that, we sort of don't have any guidance. But I think it's very important that journalists speak up, that we get this notion out, and if there is a case, then the judges have some access to what's the thinking behind this, and what is the rationale, and how should they define these constitutional rights? Because obviously it's important. It's not just something that's in any kind of rule or regulation that you can hide. It's the highest law of the land, and we just don't have clarity on what these rights mean in a lot of cases.
So in that respect, we could set a precedence, right?
Yes, that's exactly what we can do.
So we did, I think, realize one of the goals of this was to empower journalists. And I think this kind of information is empowering, right?
No, right, absolutely.
And it clearly states it's for Bhutanese journalists. So these are are we talking about the fully employed journalists? Are we also including bloggers or social commentators that are rampant on Facebook? So who are we specifically talking about here?
I'm glad you're asking this question, because while we have mentioned that this is for Bhutanese journalists, since it's a product of the Journalists Association of Bhutan, but it's really applicable to anybody who's producing any content, because the rules are applied to all of us, not just to journalists. So so I mean, even a blogger, I mean, Denkar is one of our honorary members. If she wants to look at this book, it will really help her as well. I mean, anybody, like you're saying, anybody on social media, if they would like to read some intelligent content, we have it here in this book.
So while you're mentioning you have it, where can journalists have access to this book?
So we have hard copies, if I may just. So we have this at our office. You can come to our office and pick it up. We also have it online as soft copies, like the ones I shared with you yesterday. So our website is www.jab.bt.
I see. Okay. Ani, I wanted to ask the legal consultant here, Kinzang. Have you ever had incidences where you had to fight for a journalist or?
Yeah. So I don't want to get into specifics because client, attorney, privileged, all that information, but just generally, yes, I think JAB did refer somebody to us. And without getting into specifics, I think a lot of journalists face this issue where they write a negative story and they are harassed. And I think the main lesson I want to say that we got out of this whole experience is that if you are a journalist, you've written a negative story, and somebody is harassing you about it, you need to document everything. So, you know, whether it's phone calls, whether you've had meetings, if you are talking to the other party, try to do it in messages because, you know, those are all traceable. And also that before you write your story, you need to be confident, right? The same things we said, corroborate your facts. You have an anonymous source, fine, you don't need to reveal your source, but you do need to corroborate the facts that the source has told you. And also definitely come to JAB and get support, because I know a lot of journalists work for private newspapers and maybe they have trouble affording a lawyer. So you can come to JAB and JAB will direct you, you know, to legal counsel or give advice on that, because I think it's very important to have someone with a legal background kind of backing you, especially if it involves like the media council, all of that. So
that was going to be my next question. Let's say if a young journalist is in trouble and she's getting calls saying there's something wrong with her article. So what is the step? What is the next step she should do? Of course, in the book it mentions that you have to loop in your supervisor or your executive producer in there, executive editor in this case. But what's the next step if it is going to be legal? What's the next step?
So you have this in-house protocol as we identified in the book, right? But suppose you work in private media most of the time, and at the conference that we had, we found out that you don't have your supervisors to protect you. You're literally left on your own. And this also, as part of this project, we got funding from UNESCO to provide pro bono legal service to our journalists. So then we kept these journalists in mind, especially those from private media who can't afford lawyers or who don't have, already this hierarchy like in BBS or in Quinza, you know, you have these editors and who can speak for you and who can defend you. So then we had this. So in case, for BBS and Quinzel employees, then you have your own internal HR structure, right? But then for private media, you don't have that kind of a structure in most private media houses. So then if you have an issue, we've had private journalists come to us and then come to us with written complaints. And they say, of course, it has to be written because it has to be documented. You come to JAB, we submit it to our board members. Then our board members give us, okay, this looks like something that JAB should take up as well. Then we call our legal consultants and then seek their legal advice and even their intervention if necessary.
I see.
So just one thing I wanted to stress that instead of the next step, if we stress on the protocols before, then the next legal steps are really not that difficult. If you have protocols in place before you write your stories, if you have proper editing, you have proper corroborating of facts, all of that, and you've documented everything, then your next step is really easy. You just got to put it all together and present it, you know? So it's more important to think about what happens before the problem happens.
So hence the book.
Yeah, so it's better.
It is mentioned in the guidebook too, some of the best practices of for a journalist. And I want to ask Namge here again, because it says that truth is the only defense to defamation in the guidebook, and a lot of the times for a journalist you have to protect your sources. Especially if they choose to remain anonymous. So what are some best practices for a journalist to make sure, you mentioned the importance of the protocol before it, so what are some best practices for a journalist?
To protect our source, you mean?
To write a story,
Right.
and if they know that, if they think they're going to get in trouble, what are some things that they should do before they write their story?
Basics, like Alkunsang also pointed out, but even as a journalist, and I'm sure Osup also has his own experiences to share, but from what I could say is, don't just go with what one person tells you. Try and find multiple sources, and again, you pointed out something that could land a lot of journalists in trouble. Who is your source? And if there's just one person, and then ethically, by our code of conduct, we're not supposed to reveal our sources, journalists. And journalists have gone to prison by trying to protect their sources, right? So if you want to, especially in a small society like Bhutan, what you want to avoid doing is putting ourselves in this hot water with just one source who we can't reveal in court, right? So then try, like Okunsang mentioned again, corroborate. Have multiple sources that can verify the claims that were made to you by one person, right? So you basically put yourself in this, you're protecting yourself. Another way I was saying was record. record, right? There's recording. Of course, we found out at the workshop that you're not supposed to record without consent. But sometimes you can be in difficult situations where you cannot seek the permission of the person who you're recording, right? I think it's up for debate. Like we said, we haven't had cases like this in Bhutan. So as a journalist, not as a lawyer, I feel that you should record, because then, I mean, of course, even if it cannot be submitted in the court of law, but at least there is some proof that maybe you were intimidated or harassed. But in that, now that we know that this isn't, this cannot be submitted in court, I always advise our journalists as well who come to me who are being harassed online. I say, do you have copies of the messages? As much as possible, don't make phone calls, because recordings, they say that, oh, because you're the party that's affected, I mean, it could be biased, right, when you're submitting it. So if you have text messages, or if you're messaging on Facebook Messenger, WhatsApp, these are really good, and they said this is we can submit this in court, right? So I would suggest these, but really, really protect yourself by having as many sources as possible.
So now that we've finally come up with the guidebook, what does this mean for, as a journalist now, for the journalists?
Okay, so let me try and put it into perspective. Okay, as far as I can see, this is a world. And Harari, in his book *Sapiens*, he points it out very clearly. He says, this is a world that is run by businesses whose vision exceeds no more than a year, and by politicians whose vision exceeds no more than 5 years. Journalists, on the other hand, tend to look at the world in a far more long-term view. Even historians like Harari himself, he had to praise himself, by the way. Yeah. Anyway, yeah. So, and we often look at ourselves as defenders or protectors of the Constitution, because everything we do is according to constitutional law. So, which may not necessarily be true in this evolving society. Ideally, all of us should be functioning according to the Constitution. Correct me if I'm wrong, okay, Kunza? By the way. The Constitution being the mother of all laws, right? But we often find that sometimes we can have bylaws and rules in certain sections of society that may not necessarily further the aims of the Constitution, the principles enshrined in the Constitution. So recently we had this issue with 2 foresters being terminated for speaking to the media as well. And that was because of a ruling in a bylaw in the BCSR. I forget the exact section 3 point blah blah, whatever. But that is unconstitutional. And in our discussions with the legal professionals, we came to find out that that is unconstitutional and that can be challenged, right? So, and we also came to understand that it's not just us, journalists who can become these agents of change, where if we find something is unconstitutional, we can push for that necessary amendment. But even people who have been wronged, say like the 2 foresters, they could have easily taken this to court and challenged the BCSR rule as well. So we've been finding out things like that and therefore being armed, I think. So our role as defenders and protectors of the Constitution has become a little more easy, I think, right now. And it helps us to navigate this complex web of legal proceedings and legal wranglings that we often find ourselves embroiled in and unable to decipher. So this handbook in that sense has been tremendously helpful, and our discussions with the legal professionals have been extremely helpful as well.
So it just gives the journalists the right to explore more topics too, and because they have this protection now, and they know what they're, the ability, and they're empowered. Like Namgizam used that word more. So Kinza, what do you see for the guidebook? As I mean, you with a legal background, what do you envision now?
I mean, I think it's really good in that it's laying out, as Namge has mentioned, how far you can go and what your limitations are. And it also brings up some of the gray areas, as Kinga said here, about what things are not clearly defined. And actually, it's kind of exciting for all of us in the legal profession, also for journalists, because you're kind of like pioneering, you're the pioneer of new issues, right? So these constitutional rights that are there that have not been defined, by speaking about it, by litigating it, you can create new law and kind of maybe in the future help future citizens, so they know what those rights mean, what their limitations are. And I think we can look at it really positively, and it's like things like the handbook and basically public discourse about our rights that will bring about change. So I think it's really great, and I hope that other professions also discuss these things, not just journalists.
Just
Oh, so
quickly,
please.
adding on to what Kinza said, that's the whole point. The Constitution is a long-term document, right? It's there for the ages. You don't want to make mistakes now that will cost a lot for our children or for their children. So that is why constitutional law and constitutional principles are so important. Just wanted to put that out there. Yeah.
Thank you.
No, I think as a consequence of this project, overall UNESCO project that we had for a free and fair media, and then now we have the legal guidebook and also the familiarization conference that we had with legal professionals. I think it just made journalists feel. I think we got excited by the end of it. No, that the possibilities. Like I am incredibly excited about the possibilities. You know, can we challenge constitutional law? Who can challenge constitutional law? In what cases now? In the case that Osup mentioned with the two civil servants, I mean, they could have started a class action suit, and most journalists weren't familiar with the term class action suit. It means you have to belong to a certain class, be affected in that class. Otherwise, we were thinking, can JAB pursue this? And they were saying no, because you're not the affected party. You're not a civil servant. So then, but suppose I go to the hospital and I have an issue there. But so as a citizen, I can actually start a class action suit, maybe on the services. And it doesn't matter that I'm a journalist. I am a recipient of the services, right? So it was interesting that we found all these things out. But at the end of it, I think we've really achieved our goal. I think hearing from somebody like Ausup and then the other journalists and our legal professionals, we've really we feel empowered because we are now at a place where there is information. We can confidently take action and make decisions. I think that was the most important for me when working on this project, and I think we've achieved that.
Let's see. As we wind up, is there anything you want to add?
So I think just being journalists, you know, your profession is about using words, and I think this dialogue was so exciting. I think that's why everybody was so excited, because we got to exchange ideas and really get to some deeper constitutional issues. It wasn't just about how do we not get sued for defamation, you know. It was more about how do we help society as a whole progress, and how do we protect our rights that are constitutional. So that was really exciting, and we can't discount the power of words or dialogue. So that was really nice.
Well, thank you so much. This was very enlightening, especially even for me. And I just got the guidebook yesterday, but it was very enlightening. And I thank you for your time and for the conversation here. And for those watching you, thank you for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.